How you doing? This is Deion Sanders, and you're watching Stephen A's World on ESPN Plus. My man.
Here is an admission I'm willing to make for all of you watching the show right now. I've never once played fantasy football. I love the National Football League. And of course, I love to compete. But I've never done it. So this year, I'm thinking of joining my first ever fantasy football league, okay? I've thought about it many times in the past. I'm thinking about it again. But this is the closest I've ever been to actually joining a fantasy football league. And who better to talk to about this than the man himself, Matthew Berry, the premier voice of ESPN Fantasy Football and the host of the fantasy show on ESPN Plus. His annual love-hate column is live on ESPN.com right now. The one and only Matthew Berry. What's going on, big time? How are you, sir? How's everything?
Stephen A., I'm thrilled to be here. I'm thrilled to be talking fantasy football with you. We've got to get you in. You and I have been friends for a number of years.
Yes,
and
we have.
I've talked to you. Every time we've talked, one of the things I always say is like, when can we get you in a fantasy league? You're like, I don't know, maybe not this year, maybe this year. I want to get you in. I think you would enjoy it. And I have to tell you, when people come to me and they say, hey, can I get in a fantasy league with so-and-so? My number one request is Stephen A. Everyone wants to shut you up. Everyone wants to compete with you on the field. You know Stephen A. I think it would be, listen, here's one thing. You may not know fantasy football, but one of the keys to fantasy football is trash talk. And who's a better trash talker than Stephen A. Smith?
That would
no
be
one in the
true.
world.
That would be true. That would be true. I might be the champion at that, Matthew Berry.
Yes.
But listen, before we get into the particulars, doesn't this require more work than the typical analyst? But I mean, it seems like a lot of work, Matthew Berry. It seems like a lot of work.
It's as much work as you want to put into it. One of the reasons that I exist and all of my colleagues here at ESPN is so that you don't have to do the work. We do the rankings, we do the research, we nerd out for you, so that you can just look at our rankings, look at our articles, look at our videos, listen to the podcast, watch the fantasy show on ESPN Plus, and be like, oh, I should draft that guy, I should ignore that guy, I should start this guy, I should sit that guy. So I don't think it's as much work, and especially knowing how closely you watch the NFL, I don't think it'll be tough for you.
All right, let's get right to it then. And when we talk about fantasy, what's the first thing I need to know about starting my first fantasy team? What's the first thing I need to know?
All right, so first off, you just sort of have to recalibrate because there are good NFL players and then there are players that are good at fantasy. We'll talk about some of them coming up here. But so, for example, running backs, there aren't a lot of bell cow running backs that get a ton of work. Only 9 players last year had more than 250 touches. So at the early parts of your draft, you want your Dalvin Cooks, your Ezekiel Elliott's, your Alvin Kamara's, Derrick Henry's, Chris McCaffrey's, the types that get tons of work because wide receiver is very deep this year. Second thing is mobile quarterbacks. You know, as great as some of the drop back passers are in fantasy, the quarterbacks can get fantasy points with both throwing and their legs. Mobile quarterbacks, you think about Josh Allen, you think about Kyler Murray, Lamar Jackson, guys like that. Those are what you want. 8 out of the top 10 quarterbacks last year had at least 200 yards rushing. So you want quarterbacks that are dual threat if you can. And finally, listen, wait on defense and kickers. They're replaceable.
Okay. Let me ask you this. What's the biggest mistake new players make when drafted for the first time?
I think two things. Number one is that they gravitate towards big name players. Like they will, a first-time player might draft Patrick Mahomes first in the first round, and Patrick Mahomes is my number one quarterback this year, but I have him as more of a 4th or 5th rounder because in an ESPN standard league, there's only 10 teams and you only start 1 quarterback. So there's 32 quarterbacks in the NFL. You're only starting 10. There's a depth at the position. You don't need to reach for a quarterback. As great as Mahomes is, there's other guys, as we just mentioned, Allen, Lamar Jackson, Dak, Russell Wilson, on and on and on. And so I think people tend to gravitate towards the big names, whereas there's some other players that may not be as well known, but are fantasy producers. Jacksonville running back James Robinson last year, not a household name, was the 5th best running back in fantasy.
Well, I get where you're coming from, and I'm definitely guilty of that, Matthew Berry, because, again, I'm going to gravitate to the big names, and I can't believe you mentioned a bunch of quarterbacks, and you didn't mention that bad man that he is, the one and only Aaron Rodgers. Is there a particular reason you didn't mention him?
I have Aaron Rodgers at 7, but the reason I have him at QB 7, he is a bad man. He is one of, if not the best quarterback in the NFL. The challenge is that he doesn't run. He'll get you some rushing touchdowns, but again, in terms of fantasy points, this is a guy that wasn't a top 5 fantasy quarterback last year, as great as a season as he had, because again, Patrick Mahomes got like 300 yards rushing last year. And so after Mahomes, you've got Josh Allen, who was actually the number 1 quarterback in fantasy last year. You've got Lamar Jackson. You've got Kyler Murray. Russell Wilson had over 500 yards rushing last year. Again, like it's just, you have a bunch of quarterbacks that all can throw as well as Rodgers. Maybe not as well, but like can put up numbers similar to Rodgers in the passing game, but get you points with their feet as well.
All right. Now I got another question for you. Let's talk about your love-hate column, okay? The first thing I saw when I read your column was that you and I both love rookie running back Najee Harris out of Alabama, who got picked up by the Steelers. Why do you think he'll be great for fantasy players this season? One of the great fantasy players this season.
Fantasy points come from basically 2 things. Here's a key for you, Stephen A., and anyone else that's trying to think about fantasy. Fantasy success comes from 2 things, talent and opportunity. You and I both love his talent, right? This is a guy that absolutely crushed at Alabama. He had 57 rushing and receiving touchdowns at Alabama over his career there, which is tied for the most in SEC history. So we love the talent of Najee Harris, and then you think about opportunity. He's going to the Steelers where he's going to get tremendous amounts of volume. Mike Tomlin always uses one running back. The last 2 years he hasn't because James Conner hasn't been healthy. The offense fell apart when Roethlisberger got hurt. But, basically from 2013 to 2018, his lead running back averaged over 20 touches a game. They used him. You draft him in the first round because they're going to use him a lot. He's a true 3-down back. He's a good pass catcher.
Right.
I'm not worried about the offensive line in Pittsburgh.
Let me transition to the Philadelphia Eagles because you like Jalen Hurts. You like the potential there. I've got the Philadelphia Eagles finishing in last place. Why should I draft Hurts for my fantasy team, considering what I think the team is going to do?
Sure. Well, this goes back to what we were talking about earlier, Stephen A., right? Again, there are good NFL players and there are good fantasy players. I think the jury is still out as to whether or not Jalen Hurts will be a good NFL quarterback, although I'm more optimistic than some others. And I think you see there on your screen, right? 51.9% completion percentage.
Yep.
People are like, but think about last year. In those 4 starts, the coaching staff is in turmoil with the front office. All his pass catchers are hurt. He's just being thrown in there. And yet, despite completing under 52% of his passes, you see it there on your screen, 23 fantasy points per game. He was the 9th best quarterback in fantasy over those 4 games because, as you see on your screen as well, 68 rushing yards. He gets you points with his arms and with his legs. I have him as a top 10 fantasy quarterback this year, again, because of the rushing ability of Jalen Hurts. And they don't have anyone else, barring some sort of trade. I know there's some rumors out there, but barring a trade, they ain't starting Joe Flacco, okay? It's going to be the Jalen Hurts show in Philadelphia, and given his rushing ability, they've added some pass catchers. Devontae Smith was a nice pick for them in the draft.
Yes,
they
he is.
Still have Zach Ertz there. I like Dallas Goedert to take another leap. Jalen Reagor, their first-round pick from last year, healthy. Give me some Jalen Hurts this year as a top 10 pick.
Okay.
Top 10 fantasy quarterback, I should say.
Let me stay within the NFC East. We'll go to another team because I know you're a fan of the Washington football team, right? So that means obviously you must love to hate the Dallas Cowboys, and you know I got no problem with that. But I actually think the Dallas Cowboys are going to win the division this year. So which Cowboys might win you a fantasy league this year?
All right, well, we disagree about who's winning the title in the NFC East, but we can debate that later. I will say this. The Cowboys are filled with good fantasy players. I think all of them, actually. I think Dak Prescott's going to have a monster year. I think Ezekiel Elliott, now with a healthy offensive line and the volume he gets, he'll be huge. I have him as a top 5 quarterback. Dak is a top 5 running back. Amari Cooper, Michael Gallup, all the pass catchers. But if you ask me to pick one, give me CeeDee Lamb, who averaged over 16 fantasy points per game last year in his 4 starts with Dak Prescott when Dak was fully healthy. You see it there on your screen, 16.3 fantasy points per game. Look, almost had 1,000 receiving yards in a season when the Cowboys had the likes of Ben DiNucci throwing for him. CeeDee Lamb is just insanely talented, and reports out of camp, now in his first full camp, we always know that NFL players make their biggest leap from year 1 to year 2. So it's his first full camp. Last year it was a shortened preseason because of COVID. And they've expanded his route tree. If you read the reports coming out of Dallas, he's lining up all over the field. So again, we know the talent and we know the opportunity. This is going to be one of the more pass-heavy teams in the NFL. I have CeeDee Lamb as a top 15 wide receiver this year.
Why, by the way, sticking with this point, why are you confident that Washington is going to win? You believe in Ryan Fitzpatrick that much? I know the defense is real, but do you have a belief in Ryan Fitzpatrick? Is that what this is about, Matthew Berry?
It's about all of that, right? So they have a top 5 defense. Stephen A., they won the division last year 7-9 with, like, you know, Alex Smith, who's now a colleague of ours, with Dwayne Haskins, who's backing up, Ben Roethlisberger. Like, they had a,
but they were 7-9.
Inconsistent, and they were 7-9. But whatever, they got into the playoffs. So you're telling me Ryan Fitzpatrick isn't worth 2 or 3 wins? Especially because, by the way, they added Curtis Samuel, they added Diami Brown, Logan Thomas, another year him. They improved their offensive line. Their
but what
offense,
about Dallas?
Hang on.
I mean, this is blasphemy. You got me talking positively about the Dallas Cowboys. They got Dak Prescott's coming back. Ezekiel Elliott is going to be there. He's willing to make amends for the season he had last year. You got CeeDee Lamb, like you just pointed out, with Gallup, with Amari Cooper. I expect the offensive line to be better and healthier.
Who's playing defense for them? They had to go all. That's going to be all rookies on that defense. Like, their defense is brutal. You and I agree on the Cowboys' offense. My argument for Washington is that Washington's got a top 3 defense, and all they need to be is competent on offense. And I believe Ryan Fitzpatrick, who at 38 years old has actually become a pretty good quarterback. Is he amazing? No. Is he as good as Dak Prescott? No. But is he above average? Yes. Look at what he was doing in Miami last year. And he's got a lot more weapons around him in Washington than he did in Miami. Good running game with Antonio Gibson, good offensive line. And again, Terry McLaurin, Logan Thomas, Curtis Samuel, the rookie Diami Brown, watch out for him. Adam Humphries, who's going to be good for 50 receptions. Like, that's a good offense. And it's an offense that's going to be in scoring position a lot because their defense is so legit. So, yeah, give me the I think it's going to be a tough division, but give me Washington over Dallas. You want to put a bet on this, my friend?
Matthew Berry, I got breaking news for you, man.
Good, sir.
I've never said this I've never said to you before what I'm about to say to you now.
Okay.
I think I'm going to join the league, man. I think I'm going to have I think I'm going to join. You've convinced me. You've convinced me. I'm going to get with my producer. Stephen A. going to do that fantasy football this season. I'm going to do that fantasy football. I'm going to do it, Matthew.
That will be awesome. I am so excited. That will be great. I will be in the league with you, and I am going to get some good players. This isn't going to be some dud league. If Stephen A. is playing fantasy for the first time, we got to get a real league.
You can't have me losing, Matthew. You can't have me losing. All right. Matthew Berry and Stephen A's World. Got Stephen A's World of fantasy football. We're going to do that fantasy football. We can do it. You can watch Fantasy Football Marathon starting tonight and continuing through Wednesday on ESPN, ESPN2, and the ESPN app. Also, catch Matthew on The Fantasy Show on ESPN Plus all season long. Plus, that man's going to be back here in Stephen A's World because he might have some explaining to do. He make the wrong picks for me. I'll tell you that right now. The great Matthew Berry. Appreciate you, my man. Thank you.
Always. Thank you, my friend.
All right, buddy.
Field Yates here. Have you heard of the ESPN Fantasy app? Your portal to the best fantasy football experience on the planet. With the ESPN Fantasy app, you are in control. From customizing your leagues to inviting friends to running your draft, it's all in there in a simple, easy-to-use layout. During the season, use it to add and drop players, propose trades, and track your progress in real time from virtually anywhere. Fantasy becomes reality when you download the ESPN Fantasy app.